Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely day. My name is Lexi. I am the communications manager and DEI lead at LookUp. But it is not about me. Today, we're here to hear our lovely panelists, and I'd love it if everyone can go around the room and introduce themselves briefly.
Hi, so my name is Jayda Murray. I am 17 years old. I'm a game designer and developer. I'm currently a senior in high school, so things are pretty busy, but I'm glad to be here to be able to share my experience. I'll pass it off to Noel.
Hi, I'm Noel. I'm 16 and I'm from Ohio, and I consider myself an LGBTQ+ activist.
Hi, my name is Elliot. I'm a 17-year-old student at the Concord Carlisle Regional High School in Massachusetts. I'm non-binary. I identify as non-binary, and I like Noel. I consider myself an LGBTQ activist.
Thank you for introducing yourselves. We have a couple more panelists. They may pop in the middle and introduce themselves again. But once again, thank you and welcome, beautiful humans. To start off, let's start broad. How has your experience been in this digital world?
For me personally, I think gaming has offered a way not just to have fun, but also to, I think, find myself in other communities. And when I was younger, that didn't really have an effect on, or like before I began to question myself, it didn't really have to do with LGBTQ+ identities, even just finding my friends and like finding my place in the social world. But yeah, as I began to get older, I think it also kind of played into my questioning of my identity, because I, in regards to representation, I didn't really find anyone that I could see. And I spent a lot of times on video games. So I think that affected me negatively in ways that I didn't really see then. But as I reflect now, I wish there had been more of that representation.
I really would like to second the point that Noel came up with. The idea that you can find yourself a community, or in a community rather, of like-minded individuals is so integral to the maintenance of our species being as it is. So the idea that you can find that in a digital space, in a modern space, and not even have to be very proactive about it. You can just sort of stumble into something and suddenly you're a part of this massive community. It's for lack of a better term, it's game changing. It really is game changing. Yeah, no, it's a huge step forward, but also like a big step to the side at the same time. I think that the idea of having this big community that you can call yourself a part of is wonderful. But at the same time, there's elements of social isolation. There's elements of, there's dangerous elements to that. There's things that some people are okay with that other people aren't. I've had conversations with people who like said something that made me uncomfortable, and that like in an online space. And, I just sort of have to be like, oh, it's fine because we're a part of the same community. Yeah, no, I just think it's a very multivaried environment, mostly positive.
I think I would have to second that notion of the idea that like each community that you can go into has its own type of vibe, its own type of set expectations that each individual in that community has, but also what that community is based around can also exemplary that. I'll give an example of BTS Army. Like we all surround around the idea of like, oh, we love these guys. They're great. They have their music. They have all their other stuff. But not everybody who's a part of that community represents the same things and ideals that you may carry into that community. So, but I think from my personal experience, a lot of the digital spaces that I've interacted with have to do with fandoms, especially since I'm, a geek that reads a whole lot of manga, does a lot of gaming and stuff like that. So all the different spaces that I've interacted with usually center around those things, but I'm also homeschooled, and I've been homeschooled pre-pandemic. So also those environments as it pertains to academics as well. But it's been good overall. I wouldn't have to complain, but that's usually because I haven't sacrificed much as it comes to being myself and understanding the expectations that I have of other people, not letting me knock down any of my expectations or my standards when it comes to knowing what it is that I'm wanting to get out of being in that community. So overall, it's been good for me.
Thank you for sharing your initial experiences and thoughts. And I'd love to dive in a little deeper into the title of this panel, which is I See Me. Do you see yourself online specifically? We're talking about representation here.
I think personally, I wouldn't say I see myself. I'd say I see many aspects of myself. Seeing that we are, a multi-tiered like creature, right? It's kind of impossible for us to say, hey, this is exactly me in any piece of media. When I was little, I very heavily associated with Luke Skywalker, and now I wouldn't like say he's my representative idol or icon in any way. Yeah, so I think definitely parts of me, right? Like the part that looks masculine but is non-binary is probably not represented as much, but the part that likes to skate and wear hats, that's definitely represented.
Yeah, I think I would definitely second that because, yeah, I think how I view myself and who I've found online has shifted with time. And I don't know, I think it's become more and more difficult because as I realize the various complexities of my identity, I find it harder to find all of them online. And I think the one that that I'm specifically kind of talking about today of being bisexual, I think that one has definitely been a little challenging because even though LGBTQ plus representation online has increased, that bisexuality has kind of been one that's been known to not, be as accurately represented in many regards. And I think that definitely affected me when I was younger. I think as I've grown, it hasn't affected me as much because like Jayda said, I know what I'm here for, I know who I am, but yeah, I'd say it's definitely shifted over time.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I wanted to ask the question, what do you think needs to be done more? I.e. on the part of game studios, on the part of social platforms, on the part of the infrastructure surrounding the internet and digital spaces. And we also have Tamiel coming in. Pardon if I mispronounce any of your names, by the way. Feel free to jump in and chime in on this question and brief introduction, please.
Yeah, I can get us started. So Grand Rising, everybody. My name is Tamiel McKeeve. My pronouns are they, them. I am a multidisciplinary artist, but I primarily right now am focusing on my skills as a writer because I think that that's my gift. I think that that's the season for this right now. So with this question, something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own platforms online is accessibility. And, a lot of people think about that in terms of our communities that are differently abled. But when we also think about accessibility in terms of people who I work customer service, and something that I notice a lot is that a lot of our community who, needs our resources, who needs access to our communities, they're not even literate to the internet. They're not literate to computers. They're not literate to the digital landscape at all. And that's something that I think that we're kind of speeding past as we're adjusting and adapting and getting more into these different platforms. Like TikTok has come right in the reins, but we still have people who are still understanding how to use Google or what Google is. And when you have that type of gap in the ways that we're connecting and in the ways that we're representing ourselves and other communities on the internet, I think it's important for us to think about access. And, you know, on so many different levels, like I mentioned, our differently able community, you know, some people cannot physically see the screen. Some people cannot literally hear what's going on. And so when we're posting videos and content, trying to educate people, trying to bring them into the community, we want to be mindful of how we can meet them where they're at, how we can assess the needs of so many people in our community and ensure that they're included and represented in that space, because it's not something that it's an easy fix. We kind of have to have that mindfulness, that awareness, that consciousness around, you know, needs outside of our own, but also how we can be leaders and set an example for what that accessibility can look like. I know on Instagram right now, the movement has really changed in terms of closed captions on certain things, or also we've had a lot of crowdfunding this year specifically to get people internet access and to get people into some of these spaces where we're doing a lot of this work. But I think we kind of overlooked how the pandemic, you know, really took everything onto a digital platform, but also left a lot of people out of the conversation who just, they don't have the access. So I think that that's something that's also important that we need to talk about, is how do we get more people a part of the conversation who were not originally a part of the conversation because of where they're coming from? And how can we meet them where they're at with understanding, with compassion, but also with grace? Because it's not like we need to force them to come into these spaces and get it all together and just learn these things. We need that patience. We need that understanding. We need to be able, like I said, to meet them where they're at and have grace in that and understanding. So I think that's important. And I'm so happy to be here with y'all.
Loved every minute of that. I saw Jayda, Noel, and Elliot all nodding their heads. Feel free to chime in. Don't wait for me to prompt you. Go ahead.
I think wonderful points made. And I think another aspect of that is reframing not just the things that are inaccessible to some people, but reframing the context by which we allow those people to view those inaccessibilities. Like the idea that, you know, like my immediate thought is my grandmother not knowing how to use my TV, which is like a very benign example, but I think a lot of people could relate to that statement of someone's elder not knowing how to use some piece of technology. And that within itself, like, I don't think that is necessarily the problem of the TV being too difficult, as much as it's us like making it difficult for the person to access it. We're like, our standard for them is here, it needs to be like here. And that doesn't have to be like down here, but you know, it needs to be like somewhere in the middle. You know, it's sort of on us as people who are already literate with the technology to open it up, like how, you know, we find ourselves on digital platforms, how we were welcomed in. You know, we sort of want to do the same thing with other people.
This is kind of going on a different route, but I guess it relates to like the concept of it being difficult to find yourself. I think one thing I talked about in my student TED Talk in regards to LGBTQ+ representation is the idea of optional representation, because that is all too common in gaming specifically, where like characters with those identities are in games and like the game makers can say, oh, there is representation, we have those identities. But in reality, either you have to choose that character yourself, like make one, or you have to go a specific course in the storyline. And though that's an important step, it's not nearly as beneficial to the LGBTQ+ community as it could be. Like including more of those characters as main characters is incredibly important for youth to see that they're not just existing, but they are important in their lives.
I think kind of stamping back onto what Elliot said, as far as, you know, teaching different people or meeting where people are at with in regards to technical literacy, and figuring out what types of ways and what types of things you can do to be able to make that type of information communicable to them, because not everybody is able to, you know, you know, be able to do the things that we're able to do right now. And in regards to your grandmother, the same thing happens with my grandma. We're thinking of buying her a new computer because, you know, all the different technical issues that she's able to have. And we're like, you know what is it that we can do to be able to help you be able to move to where it is that we want you to be? Not like, and it's because she also wants to be in that place, not because we're forcing her to be able to do that, but because she also wants to be able to interact in those same type of spaces with us. And from a more personal note, as it comes to representation, I think that for me, the issues that I experienced inside of the gaming community was because of my own mental health issues and how certain choices inside of the games required me to make decisions that didn't align with my beliefs or where I was. And specifically for one game that came out recently, for one of the choices that you had to make, you had to kill yourself in order to move on to the next level. And for a person who had gone through, you know, thinking about committing suicide, but not actually wanting to act on that, but just thinking that, you know, I didn't want to live. And sorry, I didn't put out like a trigger warning. So, you know, note here, but, you know, figuring out what is it that we can do to be able to make even those types of spaces in gaming accessible, maybe trigger warnings or being able to make a toggle for within your own story to be able to be like, okay, this happens, but this is also not going to detriment the story and the entire purpose of your game. And this is coming from a developer perspective because I am a game developer and game designer. So it's a lot more work to do any of these types of things, but it's going to be better in the long run because one, you get more people onto your platforms and onto your programs, and they're able to interact and make your space even larger. And if you don't care about those things from a humanitarian perspective, you'll make more money even from those things. So there's still incentives to be able to take advantage of all of those aspects.
I want to touch on that real quick. I really like the concept that you were bringing up of like you keep going back to the accessibility aspect of the digital platforms, which I love. And I think another aspect to that is the idea that if you can't access like a game that you seem interested in because of themes or content, suddenly you're limited to games that you may not be interested in or may not be represented in. You know, I know in like older Animal Crossing games, for example, they didn't have like different skin tone availability options, and they didn't have like BIPOC hairstyles in older Animal Crossing games, and now they do. But you know, that's only as a result of gradual change and meeting people where they're at. And it, a lot has to do with perspective. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And once again, specifically about the, excuse me, 1 second. Okay. I actually wanted to hear more about some of the people who are developers or coders or have acted to make their communities better. How have you really flipped the script to make your corner of the internet brighter?
Well, in one aspect, I think I'll talk about a game that I was able to help develop earlier of the summer of 2020, when George Floyd and all the other things that were coming up during that summer. Me and my sister and a friend of ours decided to make a game that talked about the process in which a Black man could get arrested by just existing, you know, just driving on his way to work. And that whole entire process. So representing different aspects of who I am has definitely helped with catering to the things that I've found lacking in these different types of communities that I'm a part of. And also sparking the conversation, because I don't want any of the work that I create to go without there being some type of narrative or some type of conversation that can be split off from that. So in that regard, I've been able to do that. As far as the mental health aspect, I still haven't been able to make something that can be able to bridge that. But I do have ideas and concepts that I can also be able to bring into other spaces with people who do have those types of games. Because with this game specifically, it was more inside of the horror genre. And usually inside of the horror genre, they have a lot of stuff that relates to suicide or to death and all these other different types of themes and concepts or other underlying themes that they want to explore within the horror genre, because it is a very revealing genre in order to be able to use that to be able to talk about a whole bunch of anything in the world. So it's just about how you're able to do that. I think if I were to make a horror game myself, then I would definitely use that bridge of, if I was to include something that's a little bit more frightening or a little bit more triggering for some people, then I would include the toggle feature or the trigger feature, enabled to be able to make my story still accessible to them without using shock factors, and instead being able to show or imply whatever it is that I'm wanting to communicate without, it being a little bit too much.
I think an example of a game that does that really well, it's this indie game you can get on most platforms. It's called Spiritfarer, and it's a game that deals with loss. You're this character in a very sort of colorful world, but you guide the souls of people who have died to their resting place. And it deals with death, it deals with loss in a very appropriate and well handled way, without having to be like very, very serious, or even like, like you were saying, shock factor. Like, it has nothing to do with trying to scare the user. It's incredibly accessible, but also touches on themes that, the user may be uncomfortable with, but it does it in a really accessible way. And I wanted to bring that up as a good example of what you're talking about.
I have a question from the Q&A, if I may jump in. And we were touching a little bit about well-being in the mental health aspect. How does the digital world affect your well-being? I believe they're specifically talking about mental health here.
So I was on a panel on Friday that spoke with Governor Deval Patrick, and was basically the premise of the panel, was like, how has the digital world and the growing digital world affected your mental health? And I think a lot of the points that myself and my compatriots came up with was the idea that sort of like I was saying much earlier in this discussion, you can find yourself in communities and you can find aspects of yourself in communities, but there's no real way to represent yourself in a community without sacrificing some sort of your mental health. Like, for example, almost any social media platform, wonderful tool for reaching out with other people, but at the same time, you are essentially sacrificing elements of yourself, of your real connections with these people, of your real connections with people who don't even exist on these social platforms, to spend time with other people on the internet. I think that's a big part of it.
Bouncing on top of that, I think sacrifice was a really great word to use, because we often don't think about the amount of time that we invest into being in digital spaces, like you said, maintaining those relationships, but also still trying to stay connected with people outside of those platforms. I realized something that's become a real challenge for me is sociability, like actually having conversations with people outside of texting, outside of DMs and commenting on their posts, but actually engaging with them in a very intimate and personable way in person, and how that provides me so much more joy and relief and what is the word? Intimacy. It's a lot more of an intimate connection when we center those relationships outside of the digital platform versus trying to maintain them on those platforms. I think it really becomes straining. For me this year, like mentally, I've not been able to cope with social media as much as I was before. Previously, I ran 5 Instagram pages, a YouTube page, a blog, a website. And it was easier to do that. I don't know, maybe because, I was related to people on a more direct level in person versus now with a lot of that relationship and just that connection being maintained over a digital platform, even if it's just my phone, it kind of makes me disconnect a little bit more. It makes me easier. It makes it easier to isolate, which is something that I know a lot of us, struggle with right now with the pandemic. But in addition to that, isolation is something that puts you in a space of feeling like, am I enough? A lot of imposter syndrome comes up. A lot of things where you really have to question, like, where is my relationship with myself, but also how does that connect with my relationship to other people? And I would say health-wise, mental health-wise, it's been finding balance. It's been really finding balance time-wise, but also going back to that sacrifice, is there something that I could be investing myself in, or is there a relationship that I could be maintaining and investing in a little bit differently or with a little bit more intention to ensure that both of our needs are met, to ensure that, what you need in this moment is matching what I need in this moment, but also to ensure that what I need is generally at the core of how we're engaging on these platforms. Because oftentimes, like I seen a post the other day, it said that we're a sad generation with a lot of happy pictures. And I don't know if anybody else saw that, but that really hit a chord for me, because when you look at, a lot of these digital platforms, even if it's just blogs or how people are engaging on other spaces, you see that it is a paradigm around how we're supposed to be living our lives right now, in contradiction to where we really are in the world. Like, people are dying, people are sick, people are losing their job, their stability, their well-being, their place in the world in a lot of ways. And if we lose sight of that in, hopes of obtaining an image or, upholding some idea or reputation of how we want to be perceived in these spaces, then I feel like it really is paving the way for us to disconnect with who we are at the core. And if you're not connected with that, then you don't really know what you need mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You're not connected with that. So I know for me, it's been really challenging finding that balance, but also understanding that it's okay for me to prioritize time and space away from those platforms without feeling like I'm disconnecting myself from the world, because that's not the world. That's just a small aspect of how we relate and how we show up in the world. But I think it's become such a large, like, it's definitely become a large piece of our connecting, how we connect to each other, how we connect to ourselves. And I think we need to be a little bit more conscious of how we're using that as a tool to create our relationships, but to also express ourselves.
A question coming in from the Q&A: what are some other suggestions for increasing inclusive representation online? What have you noticed on Instagram and TikTok they cite specifically?
Before we jump in and answer that question, I have a quote from Governor Patrick as we were talking on Friday. Something he brought up, very similar to what Tamiel is saying, but something he brought up was, you can break up over text, but you can't fall in love over text, right? Like, there's, like, you are sacrificing so much of your connection with the individual and with the self in any of these spaces as a result of simply using them.
Something that I like that's increasing in terms of inclusivity on the internet is the body positivity, or just like how we see ourselves, like the image of how we see ourselves in relationship to the propaganda that we see on these platforms. Like, Lizzo is one of my favorites right now because she is unapologetically herself. And I think that that is something that we really need to understand on a lot deeper level, because to be unapologetically yourself means I'm not sorry that I am who I am. I'm not sorry about your perspective of me or what I need to do or who I need to be. I'm not sorry. And I think that keeps us in a space of understanding how important confidence is, and being yourself, but also in sharing yourself in relationship to other people. And that's where inclusivity comes from. That's where diversity comes from. It's how we relate all together with our differences. But if we're all trying to be the same, if we're all trying to look the same, if we're all trying to mold into this image of oneness that is not in alignment with who we really are as one, as a true individual being, then it's creating a disconnect in itself, because nobody's being authentic to who they really are. And that's where inclusivity comes from also, is you have to show up as your realest self to feel like you're being included in the space. Otherwise, you're going to feel like there's something missing. You're going to feel like there's a disconnect. So I think that body positivity that I'm seeing in a lot of these spaces is really making me personally feel like, a lot of the work that we're doing as a culture can be implemented in very tangible ways. It's not just about theory anymore. This is really becoming a practice of how we see each other, how we relate to each other, and how we decolonize some of the ways that we've been taught to understand what that looks like or what that needs to feel like for it to be politically correct. Like, we're people. And if we don't start to learn to relate and, really connect with each other on the basis of our differences, but also on the basis of where we relate to each other, then we're not really connecting in that humane type of way. Like, there needs to be a lot more humanity in the relationships that we're creating on these platforms. And I think that inclusivity with things like, not only your physical appearance, but also the ways that people are wanting to embrace who they are. There's a lot more space for that on these platforms also. And I think that comes with there being a lot more diverse spaces for people to see themselves, people not being afraid to create spaces where they want to see themselves and be, but also just understanding that when it comes to inclusivity, we have to, one, be open to difference. We have to be open to things that are not all the same. And that's something that's very challenging for our culture, because we have a very hegemonic culture where everything is supposed to be the same. Everybody's supposed to look the same and feel the same. And anything outside of that is an outcast. But once we outcast that perspective, then it really allows us to live in a space of being together and really on the same page, even if everybody is not exactly the same.
I think wonderful point. And I want to give the other speakers some time to speak, but I wanted to jump in with the idea that as a society, like I love using the term decolonize, or the way we think. I like it. I like the term. I find that it is further and further more difficult to decolonize the way others think, as opposed to decolonizing the way you think. It's really easy to start with yourself, but the moment that you are realizing that, in someone else's mind you're representative of something, like an issue, like in someone else's mind, me as a non-binary person could be representative of the issue of LGBTQ people, and like how that's an issue. That within itself, like, you have to meet, like what Jayda was saying long before I started talking, the idea that you have to meet people where they're at. The proactive activist doesn't expect everyone else to think the same as them, right? And that's kind of what makes them an activist. They know that no one else thinks like them. And they're willing to, and they go out of their way to meet people where they're at.
Noel, you go.
I'm sorry. I just kind of want to jump off of that idea, and also the idea that we were talking about before of bringing your whole self to the table, and how important that is to well-being of social media as a whole. Because I think I totally agree that there are sometimes only specific parts of our identity that are represented online at a time. And specifically, so I'm in I'm part of the LGBTQ plus club at my school, and something that we talked about was how crucial sometimes that representation in discussions online can be to not only our contributions online, but sometimes how those discussions online can affect ourselves. And it's insane how or not insane, but it's undeniable how that can affect us emotionally and mentally, because there's the good and the bad. Because in many ways, for some of my classmates, online is the only community they have apart from our club, because their families just do not accept them. And they feel like online sometimes is the only place they can be themselves in that regard. On the other hand, there is gatekeeping sometimes, which can also affect someone emotionally and mentally, because, like saying, oh, this one identity isn't truly like part of our community, when in reality it is. And so yeah, I think there's definitely that healthy balance. And, sometimes having those conversations in person can help us kind of understand what's happening online too. But yeah, I think finding those communities and understanding from your own perspective what you're hoping to get out of it, what's true, what you can kind of, cast aside as, gatekeeping, things like that. I think that healthy balance.
I think topping on top of everything that everyone else has said, for some things that I've seen in regards to inclusivity is the amount of information that has been tagged onto different types of subjects. So like for me, I'm a part of like all these different types of communities, but I've also gotten interested in foraging. And there's a whole lot of different like cultural aspects that like usually wouldn't be a part of that conversation if you were only looking through one lens. But because of, now that we're online and everything, everyone has a different piece of information that they bring to the table, and it's just accessible. You can see it, it's there. And especially if you start to actively follow people who don't only show off only one line of that particular view, then you're able to get an even more well-rounded experience, especially when it comes to all these different types of things. But I think as it comes to being a part of a community and making sure that, you're being your true self is, again, understanding what it is that you're trying to get out of technology. If you're using it as a means to be able to, check up on your friends, because I mean, for me, I've moved at least 9 times. So all my friends live all over the place and I'm not able to meet them in real life. And especially with, the pandemic, that's even been even more strenuous, even with the people that I now know here inside of the city that I live. So knowing your expectations for yourself and also the things that you're not going to want to cancel out when you interact with other people, if you're inside of a space where there aren't people with the same types of views that you have, knowing how a game plan of how you're going to interact with those people so that you don't get stressed out, because your emotions don't have to play on top of how other people interact with you, though they definitely can, but you don't have to, your entire day doesn't have to be ruined. It definitely can be, but only if you're hinging yourself upon how you're deciding to view yourself through other people instead of, I'm confident in myself, I know who I am, and I don't have to be wrecked by whatever people say. So I think that that's another thing to carry in mind.
I'd like to jump in with a question from the audience. How do you suggest to take the risk to be authentic, even in the world of cancel culture? I noticed you were all talking quite a bit about authenticity, finding a way to be yourself. This individual would love some advice on how to do that.
I think for me, a couple of things is having actual conversations with people, especially since, if you can post something on your story, then somebody, it might be only one person, might respond to that story and, ask a question or, make a statement on that. You can always just follow up and to begin to dialogue with them. I find that to be extremely helpful. And also not leaving things as one-liners, because especially if it's one post, it's just a picture. It's always good for me, and this is because I love to over-explain so that I'm not misunderstood with what I'm trying to represent. So I'll explain whatever it is that I believe based off of that thing. I don't agree with everything that this person posted, but I do like this one segment. What are your thoughts? Sparking a conversation around it and making sure that you're still being able to position yourself where you are without having to, contradict anything that you believe. And making that stance, and also giving the space for other people to be able to be themselves in that conversation with you. And again, understanding that they are not where you are if they aren't, and still being able to have that conversation.
I just going exactly in alignment with what Jayda just spoke of, radical acceptance. I think radically accepting who you are, what you have to bring to the table. And then I know, I don't know if this is something that's a commonly understood term, but also the parts of yourself that you feel like are unloving, your shadow side, like the parts of yourself that you feel like, don't nobody want to see this, don't nobody want to feel this, can't nobody relate to that. You have to radically accept all of you. And, you know, we live in a world that already conditions us to be so far from ourselves. So to even in that part say, I want to be me, that's radical. That's not like an everyday thing. That's very radical. So in accepting that, authenticity kind of starts to flow naturally because parts of yourself start to become unveiled. Like you start to strip yourself of things that are not really you, ideas and perspectives and beliefs that are not really in alignment with who you are at the core. And then, as Jayda just spoke to, having conversations with other people, creating that space to be confirmed from the universe and who you are and what you stand on, and allowing yourself to really grow in that through other people, through their experiences, and then being radically accepting of, like Jayda mentioned, you know, where you are in comparison to where other people are, and not making it a thing where you feel like it's a competition, or, you know, I'm far behind, or I'm not enough, or I'm all the way here and they're all the way there. It's not a comparison. We're all on a different journey. We're all authentically unique in ourselves. And so with that, you have to allow space for that authenticity to exist. There needs to be a safe space for, you know, you to show up as your fullest self, but for other people to show up as their fullest selves also. And a lot of confirmation comes from that because you start to see the parts of you that are more in alignment with who you are. And also, you know, you start to see the parts of other people that resemble things that you want to embody, which adds to your authenticity because it brings you closer to who you are naturally as an essence. So I think that that's important, is to just be radically accepting. And that's not easy. It's definitely easier said than done. But once you put yourself into that mindset, into that attitude that, you know, it just is what it is. It allows you to really open up more, like your mind, your heart, and your presence. You're really able to open up and be a little bit more open-minded and expansive in the ways that you approach different things. Cognitive flexibility is what some people call it, being able to hold multiple perspectives and multiple experiences in one, and allowing that to not discredit who you are.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences. I'll wrap it up briefly by saying that I watched the UN General Assembly recently. And there was a quote from BTS as a special envoys talking about how Gen Z or young people broadly are seen as the lost generation or the corona generation. But rather they prose the concept of it being the welcome generation, welcoming change, welcoming and taking the challenges of this world and being active and doing what they can with their bandwidth to do something about the world that they are given. And I'd love to hear brief words about what you're hopeful about in this world online. What brings you hope as we wrap up?
You know, I think,
Go ahead.
okay, I'll say, yeah, kind of like we talked about before, I think the like reclaiming of our generation of social media is something to, you know, so that we may define social media and social media will not define us. I think that's a huge thing that we need to learn and can learn and definitely can do in the future.
I think a big aspect is finding more and more of yourself in other people. You know, that's what I find what love is. Love is finding aspects and bits of yourself in other people. And you know, knowing that the internet and being online is a good outlet for that.
I think on that same token, finding people who are a little bit like me, and again, it doesn't have to be the entirety of who I am. Like I can't duplicate and clone myself to become a whole nother version of me. That's not going to happen. But it's definitely, it brings me joy finding people who, you know, have similar beliefs in me, like me rather, and you know, some of the same interests, and even starting conversations with those people to better get to know them, and not just, you know, deciding to be yourself and only, you know, when you're interacting on a platform, only being yourself for getting what it is that you can get out of the platform, but also being there for other people. Because though, you know, technology is something that we can use as on an individual lens, it's also part of a collective. And the internet is basically like its own mini country. So the way that we decide to use it and interact in that space is very telling. And so I find it to be very helpful to interact the same way that I do online, the way that I do in real life, and not being able, not shelling any of the things that are a part of me. So being, again, on top of being authentic to yourself, and interacting in those spaces in that regard.
Thank you so much once again, beautiful humans, for sharing your experience, your thoughts. And I'd like to welcome all of our attendees in the chat to please join our next event, Can a Like Change the World? And it's also going to be a panel of more Gen Z speakers. So have a lovely day. Everyone stay hydrated, please. It's hard out here. Stay hydrated. Bye.